Genesis, they would accuse women who were not enjoying the kind of horrific marriage arrangements that they were in as having male protests. Women who wanted to work jobs were told as having male protests. Women who didn't want to have more kids were told as having male protests. And the therapy that would be given to women would literally look like punishing women and saying, you have to feign that you're enjoying sex. You have to feign that you're enjoying housework. You have to feign that you're enjoying being domesticated in order to preserve the sanctity of marriage. The fear, and this is now a fear that is still being echoed by conservatives today, recently with Tucker Carlson on the Fox Network speaking about replacement theory, the fear in post-World War II United States was this recurrent fear that white Christians were being outnumbered by immigrants, were being outnumbered by people of color. And so the goal of this baby boom moment was to reproduce as many white families as possible in order to maintain racial supremacy. So now I'm going to dial back for a second. What I'm trying to get you to understand here is the interconnections between gender norms and race. The reason that eugenicists moved their focus away from negative eugenics that was explicitly racist to positive eugenics to focus on indoctrinating people into gender norms is because they thought the way that they could win the racial fight was by maximizing reproduction of white Christians. So the goal became about policing white people into the gender binary, punishing and pathologizing any white person who said, I have other things to do with my life, other things to do with my body, make them seem like they have a disorder. In fact, marriage counselors came up with a gender test that would test how masculine you were and how feminine you were. And then they would say the reason that your marriage is failing, the reason that you're unhappy is because you're not feminine enough if you're a woman, or you're not masculine enough if you're a man. Not that you're in an abusive relationship. Not that you have other things that you want to do with your life. Not that actually no one should have to devote their entire life in the service of someone else, right? It became about you, and your problem is that you're not able to perform your gender enough, right? So what I'm trying to get you to understand here is that the reason that we see this 1950s, 1960s indoctrination into extreme binary domestic gender norms is as part of this idea of maintaining the supremacy of white evangelicalism in this country, right? This idea that we need to have more white Christian children in order to have the numbers to outnumber immigrants and people of color. So why is this history relevant for us today? What we see in the United States now is the ongoing history of conservative factions using the rhetoric of family values as a way to do this long-standing racist and homophobic project. Family values has become a smokescreen or a shield for people to justify their bigotry as something that's positive. Of course, none of us would protest the importance of family values. We're like, yeah, that sounds really important and great. But that's not what they're actually doing. What they're using family values as a Trojan horse to do is to justify their homophobia and their transphobia and their racism without ever being able to be called racist, homophobic, or transphobic. So what's happening right now with the rise of anti-trans discrimination, and if you've been following me, you understand that there are 33 states in the United States right now that are trying to pass over 110 pieces of anti-trans discrimination. They're often using the rhetoric of protecting the family and protecting gender. But what this actually is a dog whistle for racist eugenics, okay? So what's really important to understand is that this is a smokescreen, that people are doing an age-old project of racism, an age-old project of homophobia. But what's so insidious about it is that they use the rhetoric of protecting the family as if queer and trans people are not in the family. And as if we're not our own family, right? So they use this rhetoric of family and of gender to obfuscate what is actually going on. And that what is going on is an ongoing project of racist eugenics. So what I want you to understand is that the policing of gender has always been and will always be in this country about race. And that's what's so frustrating oftentimes when people speak about anti-trans discrimination, is that people want to pretend that this is just about a vulnerable minority of trans people. But what I want you to understand is that in moments of racial unrest, when Black people in particular are pushing up against systematic racism, white people double down on traditional gender norms as a way to actually maintain racial supremacy. So the backlash of anti-trans discrimination is not just about trans visibility, it's also about a backlash against racial justice. And the policing of people into the gender binary has always been about a backlash to racial justice, because it's about trying to say that the only way to live your life, the only way to live your gender, and the only way to live your sexuality is for the purpose of reproduction of white Christianity. Does that make sense for people? Okay, so now I'm going to take any questions that people have about Eugenic Nation. To read these concepts, because I know it can be really new for people, please check out the book report where I detail all of these things with citations, of course. And if you want to learn more about eugenics, you can look at my book reports in January, where I have about 6 or 7 books on the history of American eugenics. But this is the first book that I have posted on post-World War II eugenics. Okay, so I'm going to be taking some questions right now. And thank you so much for all the donations to the 33 of you who've given badges. A new function by Instagram is that you can give multiple badges now in a live, which is new. So thanks, Instagram, for that. Okay. Okay, we just have some hate mail in the comments. So waiting for some real questions. Someone's saying, conservatives don't really understand that you can't cull trans people. It's part of the human condition. Yes, absolutely. Trans people have been here for thousands of years, will continue to be here. Yes, I do have an audiobook of my book, Beyond the Gender Binary. And what they're trying to do is a eugenic goal of trying to disappear trans people, right? And this has been an ongoing project in this country since its inception, but in a formalized way since the 1870s, right? So what's really important to understand is that in the 1920s and 30s, visibly gender nonconforming people like me were the mainstream representation of queer life. We were called third sexers or pansies or fairies. And if you look at newspapers, we were often on the cover and people were talking about slum tours, going to downtown Chicago or New York to watch people like me perform, right? And a lot of our mainstream culture actually comes from mainstream straight cis people going and watching us and our underground queer nightlife and then inventing contemporary fashion and beauty trends, but that's another lecture. So what happens in the early 1900s is the idea that racist scientists came up that the white people were somehow superior to Black people and indigenous people because of their gender norms. So the idea was, as they racially evolved, they became more pure men or pure women, whereas people of color and Black people were all gender ambiguous or sexually indistinct, as they would say. And so as part of that racist eugenic project, what they had to do was try to disappear white LGBTQ people. So what we see is forced lobotomies of white LGBTQ people, chemical conversion, castrations, medical incarceration, cross-dressing laws that were essentially trying to disappear white LGBTQ people in particular, because white LGBTQ people were seen as vestiges or leftovers, primitive hangovers that had not yet evolved into the like modern white supremacist idea of what someone should be. So this idea or this ambition to disappear trans people has always been a racial strategy and a racial project, right? And it's really important that we name that, because I think so often the discourse around trans rights in this country is very white, and we often only defer to the leadership of white trans people, and especially white trans people who have undergone medical transition, when at its foundation, anti-trans discrimination and anti-trans violence in this country was foundationally targeting Indigenous, Black, and POC, visibly gender nonconforming people. But it's our communities that are often disarticulated because of eugenics. A lot of trans people are also complicit in these histories of eugenics and saying that the only way to be legitimate as a gender is through traditional Western gender norms, which is a eugenic project. But those are all different lectures and different books, so I won't go into that. Could I connect phrenology and eugenics? Yes, I'll do that. Current examples of eugenics outside the US, I can speak to that a little bit. The use of Christianity as an instrument of eugenics. Yes, I'll speak about those three things. Okay, so phrenology is the study basically of skulls and basically the ranking of races on people's skull perception. So in the 1800s, the sort of predominant idea was that the reason that white men were superior to women and to people of color was because of the size of their skull. And so they would basically measure skulls of people across the world to selectively argue that white brains were bigger and therefore better and more superior. And what you would see in a lot of the arguments was that they would say that white women's skulls were closer to Black people. So this was all part of creating what is called a racist evolutionary continuum. The idea that Black people are somehow closer to animals and that through racial evolution, people achieve white manhood. And white manhood is seen as the pinnacle of evolution and civilization. So phrenology predated eugenics. Phrenology was there in the early 1800s in some ways. But eugenics, actually, what it did, which is unique, is it then brought this racist science that had already existed into policing reproduction. So what makes eugenics unique is that its theory of change is that the way that we can initiate racism is through regulating reproduction and actually selectively becoming kind of God's designer. So eugenics emerges in this post-Darwin moment when scientists basically want to say, we want to finish God's work of evolution. And it's our job to actually ensure that the future generations will be the most perfect ever. Really dystopic and creepy. And so what makes eugenics unique is the emphasis on regulating reproduction. And that is really an important thing that helps us understand why in this country it's been so difficult for Black mothers and Black birthing people to give birth, is because of these histories of eugenics, which explicitly are interested in making it as easy as possible for the creation of white life and as difficult as possible for the creation of Black and Indigenous life. Okay, the next question was about examples of eugenics outside the United States. There's so many, but I'll speak to a book called The Biopolitics of Beauty, which is about the history of eugenics in Brazil. So if you're interested in Brazil, really check out this book called The Biopolitics of Beauty. And what eugenicists in Brazil did was just so intense because they would literally create equations with the face of an Indigenous woman plus the face of a white man equals the face of a beautiful light-skinned mixed-race person. This was in eugenic textbooks in Brazil. And what they basically were proselytizing was forced rape and sexual violence of Indigenous and Black communities as a way to whiten the blood pool, right? And this happens across Latin America and South America, is that eugenicists actually advocated that the way to civilize Black and Native people was by giving them white blood, which was seen as superior, civilized, more human, which we know is institutionalized sexual violence, right? And the goal was about disappearing Indigenous and Black features, which were seen as ugly, animalistic, wrong, and transitioning Brazil into being the most beautiful nation state that had the most Anglo-European features. And we see the implications of this in contemporary Latin America and South America with the reverence for traditionally European features and the complete demonization of indigenous features. And that's why also it is still so difficult in many places across the world for indigenous people to do family planning. It's very ironic that the religious right that is talking about family values isn't talking about how it's a family value for Black people to not fear that their children will be gunned down through state violence, how it's a family value for indigenous people to have access to clean water, to be able to survive. Like, why are those not family values? It's only family values when it comes to the preservation of Christian evangelical life, not about the preservation of disabled life, Black life, indigenous life, right? So it's really important to call that bluff of that smokescreen. And then the final question someone is asking is about how religion has been weaponized in the service of a eugenic project. And I really want to be very clear about this. I am not anti-Christianity or anti-religion. Absolutely not. I think that there is so many liberatory traditions of religion, spirituality, and Christianity. I think that when we're speaking about Christianity in the US, we can't never not speak about the history of civil rights and Black people using the church as a way to do powerful racial justice organizing. So what I am critiquing here is the ways in which Christianity was used and weaponized and deputized in the service of eugenics. And there's a long history of that in this country. During slavery times, white Christians would justify the institution of slavery using biblical texts. The idea was that slavery and colonialism were divine ordained. And when you say that something is divine ordained, you don't have to be accountable because you get to basically say, we're doing this on behalf of God. But we should always question who speaks for God and who speaks for nature, right? And it's typically people in power who speak for God and speak for nature as a way to justify their discrimination. Because when we say something's discrimination, what we're saying is this is a result of your political and social choices. But people use the rhetoric of God and the rhetoric of nature as a way to say, no, this is just the way that things were meant to be. That's not true, okay? So the way that Christian evangelicals would use Christianity in the service of eugenics is that they would basically say, the reason you can't have an interracial partner is because it goes against the church. You must marry within your race because that goes against your church. There is no spiritual text that says that, in fact, religion should be an argument for the power of love, and the idea that you shouldn't be with someone that you love because they are a different race. That's not religion. That's racism, right? And so you would see people use Christianity as a way to justify anti-miscegenation, which banned interracial intimacy. Then you would see people using Christianity as a way to justify traditional gender roles. And this still happens today. And this is an ongoing project of marginalizing women. In the 1900s, men would basically say the reason that women are unequal in society is because of Adam and Eve, and they would use biblical texts as a way to justify women's subordination in society. And unfortunately, this continued into the 20th century with men justifying traditional gender roles and spaces for women using religion. So the argument now happens that the role of women in society is mothers, when in fact, motherhood is a choice, not a biological destiny. Women should be able to decide whether or not they want to parent, and it should not be seen as more legitimate, more real, more just to be a parent than to devote yourself to your own life, your own career, your own aspirations, your own ideas, your own scholarship, right? But what Christian evangelicals began to do is to shame women for having ambitions that were contrary to motherhood and to family values, and say that it was against the church, right? And so people have weaponized the church to punish and police people into traditional gender roles and gender norms. So that now what we hear is people saying, I'm not against trans people, it's just against my religion. And what they're using once again is religion as a smokescreen to justify bigotry. And it's really important that we can identify those smokescreens, and that's what I'm trying to do in a lot of my work. Please check out my book, Beyond the Gender Binary, And in that, what I try to teach is the different smoke screens that people are using, like science, like women's rights, like religion, to justify bigotry. And what's important to understand is that racism and transphobia are not opinions. We can have different opinions about like food that we like, but we can't have different opinions about whether people with disabilities, trans people, Black people, Indigenous people are worthy of dignity and human rights, right? That's a very crucial distinction there. Okay, true to form, I went over time. I'm so sorry. I really need to get so much more quick and pithy about these, but there's just so many things to say. Thanks so much, everyone, for donating. I really appreciate it. To the 49 badges. Thanks, Instagram, for allowing people to give multiple badges in a live. To learn more about the subjects that I brought up today, check out my most recent book report on the history of marriage counseling, which is a review of an incredible work of scholarship called Eugenic Nation, published by University of California Press in 2015. To learn more about the history of eugenics in the United States, check out my book reports from the early 1900s. Oh, sorry, not early 1900s. Wow. I was not writing book reports in the early 1900s. Sorry. From January to learn more about those topics. And stay tuned for some future book reports on the science of sex and sexuality. I really want to teach people how to respond to the weaponizing of science as a way to justify inequality. That's bullshit. Science is one of the most profound arguments for gender and sexual diversity. If you had any questions that I didn't get to, feel free to comment them in the latest book report, and I'll try to incorporate them into my next lecture. And I appreciate and love and need you so much. Let's create a world beyond eugenics where people have fundamental worth and value simply for existing, not for having to be some arbitrary rules and norms that were dictated before them. Okay, I'm just going to give a last minute for any last badges. Thank you.